Intersectionality is a relatively new topic of conversation, and today we're going to explore what it means to us, our industry, and how we navigate the cross-section around it. Good afternoon and welcome to our virtual event. What is intersectionality and why does it matter? My name is Kirat. I'm the co-chair for the Insurance Families Network, and I will be your moderator today. Before I introduce our fabulous panel, please may I ask our audience to answer the Slido question on the current understanding of the topic. Hopefully you've clicked on the QR code. Okay, fantastic. So we've got a bit of an even mix here. More people know less about the topic than do. So it's really important that we are actually having this session today. Thank you. Allow me to introduce and welcome our panel, whose bio you will have seen on the Dive In registration site. Joining us today, we have Arani from Kennedy's, Andrew from Gallagher, and Jen from WTW. I'm going to begin with the all-important question for Jen, which is, how would you explain intersectionality in simple, practical terms for those, especially in our audience, that may not be familiar with it?
No pressure going first then. So thanks, Kirat. Great to see everyone today. Thanks for having me. So we think about intersectionality as a relatively new term. It's actually not. Kimberly Crenshaw was the civil rights advocate and kind of legal scholar who first sort of termed the coin intersectionality. And that was actually about 35 years ago. So it's not quite as new as we might think. And she was really thinking about the collision of identities. And actually at the time, how anti-discrimination law looked at race and gender separately. So there was an example at the time of a legal case, the story of an individual who worked for a car manufacturing company in the US, and there was a discrimination case where she said that she argued that she hadn't got a job at this car manufacturer, and the judge dismissed the case, saying that they did in fact employ white men, and they employed black men and they employed white women, and she sort of argued that she hadn't got the job because she was a black woman. So it was really at this time that Kimberly took a real interest in this, and was thinking about this kind of collision of identities, but really wanted to have a kind of framework for people to think more broadly when we think about identity. So I had the fortune of hearing her earlier this year. She delivered a keynote at a conference I was at, and she was talking about this concept of having, of thinking about intersectionality as a framework to widen your lens of thinking. And what she did, and I remember it really clearly, is she shared a picture on a screen for us all. And in that picture, there was a field full of cows. And she said to us all the participants, the cows are sick. Whose problem is it? So we all sort of look around, thought, well, it's the farmer's problem. And then she zoomed out of the picture. And in the picture, you now see the cows in the field, but you see a nuclear power plant across the road and a big highway or motorway, lots of traffic. And she says, the cows are sick. Whose problem is it? And really what she was trying to get us to do is just widen that lens of how we think and how we think about identity. And I just think it's a great thing for us to remember as we think about intersectionality and having this framework to encourage us to be more kind of expansive in our thinking. So as I said, she really started off thinking about this intersection between gender and race, but it's much more expansive now. You know, when we think about intersectionality now, and not just thinking about, you know, one aspect of identity.
Thanks, Jen. I really enjoyed listening to that, especially listening about Kimberly's analogy of intersectionality and thinking out of the box about how gender and race, it started with that 35 years ago, but we've moved on so much since then. And exactly as you said in your opening remarks was, we think it's relatively new, but actually it isn't. Thank you very much. So when people share lived experiences, it can help others understand what life is really like. Arani, how do you look at overlapping identities like race, gender, disability, and socioeconomic status? How does that shape someone's experience, do you think? She's on mute.
Classic there.
Don't worry, we've all been there.
Very relatable. Thanks everyone for joining the session. I think that there's a lot that we all realise has changed since the global pandemic, and of course we've all had different experiences of what was like for us, particularly the lockdowns. But I think coming back to a working environment, an office working environment, I think there's definitely a lot of commonality. And I think it's important to remember that the 9 to 5 or longer hours, etc., has not really been fit for purpose for quite some time. And I think the pandemic really brought that into focus. In the past, that idea of 9 to 5, I think, was probably predicated on a person that doesn't really exist so much now, which would have been somebody who was a male, who was heterosexual, who had a partner, probably a wife if they were cis male, and they would be staying at home and looking after the household. In that scenario, of course, you can work really efficiently between 9 and 5 because you don't have anything else topping and tailing your day. You don't have anything to worry about in terms of picking up children, caring responsibilities. You don't have to worry about getting the food on the table or, you know, doing the shopping necessarily. So that isn't really fit for purpose for anyone now, I don't think, because I think everyone has got something else in their rucksack, so to speak, when they come to the starting line of work. In terms of my own experience, I think it's really interesting how even now, when you say have to fill in any kind of monitoring form for, you know, the Equality Act 2010 purposes, it's not always that we all fit into a box, really. And I think that even some of the assumptions there, for example, you know, if you tick a particular box about, you know, whether you had free school meals or whether you went to private school, things like that. And I think it still sort of presumes that you are one thing and not another thing. And I think that we have to be a lot more mindful of how we all come to work.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm really, is that a screen frozen?
Are we still good?
Sorry, the screen froze for a bit there.
Okay, no problem. So essentially, I think that it's really important that we understand about overlapping identities, because I don't think that in the pillars of how we come into the framework of work, or even all the statutory framework around it, doesn't really account for that. And I think that we have to do that ourselves. I think broadly speaking for me, I was diagnosed with ADHD shortly before I joined Kennedy's about 5 years ago, and I had no experience of that at all. It was the first role I had done since being diagnosed. I was formerly a client-facing lawyer dealing with healthcare claims for about 20 years. So for me to kind of come into business services, come to a new firm, and with this diagnosis was quite a lot. And I think it's fair to say that Kennedy's is on a journey, and I think lots of organisations are on a journey. And I think whilst we're all on a journey, the way that we can really understand each other better is through lived experiences and sharing those. And the main thing I want to get across for now is that we are all others in some way. It could be through family, it could be through an experience that you've had at work, it could be how you believe you identify. There's lots of situations where we don't feel like maybe we are the most dominant group in any situation, and I think that's very relatable. And the other thing I'd like to say for now is that I think that there's a lot of there's definitely a mindset around what it means to be professional, and I think for a lot of times that's about, you know, not talking about anything inverted commas personal. You know, I think in the past have been expected to fit into a bit of a monolith, which again I don't think is really true. And the thing is, the personal is professional, because you're bringing yourself to work and expected to, you know, perform your professional duties. But in order to do that, you have to be acknowledged for all the things that you might be elsewhere. So, for example, internally, if you've got to have more flexibility to be available elsewhere but still get your work done at a different time, if you have to change things at short notice, but, you know, with the support of your team, these are all things that are professional, I think, now. And I think that's where our teams are headed for. And it's really important to bring in the sense of community within business. I think there is room for community in work, and I think that that is about being professional too. I trained very fortunately at Kennedy's as a mental health first aider, and it was absolutely wonderful. It was a great sort of 2-day session. And one of the things that I really took away from that is that, you know, one of the questions that came up was, if somebody had a mental health crisis and you were about to go to a meeting with a client, what would you do? And there was discussion about what you would do, because, you know, I think before it was like, well, of course, the client, oh my God, we've got to keep the client at all costs. But is that really human? Would you say that if somebody was having a heart attack? Would you say, I'm sorry, you're having a heart attack, I've got to go and attend to the client? I think I would like to think that amongst our internal colleagues, but also externally facing our clients and stakeholders, that they would understand, you know, and that being professional in business is to be human and to connect. And I think it's really important that we all remember that.
Thanks so much, Arani. I love the way you finished that. Being professional is business is also to be human, and that's really, really important. And I'm really pleased you highlighted the fact of the major change since the pandemic. And there's been a huge shift, as you said, in flexible working, hybrid working, and people bringing them whole selves to work. And thank you for sharing your personal journey with what you went through as well. So thank you. So that takes me on to Andrew. You've been in the industry a number of years now. So what advice would you give to individuals who are just starting to explore the intersectionality, be it in their own lives or whether it's at work?
Oh, thank you very much, and hello everyone. It's a good question. It's not a simple answer, If you're just starting to get your head around intersectionality, I'd say the first thing you need to address is understanding how you're viewing the world and the lens you look at the world in. Understanding your own perspective will allow you to understand how you view other people's identities, your own identity, and the various different biases involved. Secondly, educate yourself. Explore resources like books, articles, online courses, or do what I do quite a lot nowadays and just spoon feed yourself with generative AI. I can definitely recommend an actual book, Women, Race and Class by Angela Davis. It's a fantastic book. It's a seminal piece of work. It covers the brutal combination of sexism, racism, and classism experienced by Black women in the US. And it explores how all of these issues are very much intertwined. And it does give a little glimmer of hope because a solution to one can benefit all. Next, actively listen. It's something you get taught if you've been on a leadership course, if you've been on any kind of executive coaching course, and it applies to so many areas of life. Just actively listen, engage in open and respectful conversations. And, just like Arani just said, this kind of thing is becoming a lot more commonplace in the workplace now. We're having personal conversations. We're appreciating that people are actually human beings and not just robots. We're respecting each other's time and emotions. So have conversations with people. It can be as simple as just how are you and how are you really? And having been on the giving and the receiving end of that question, it can make a massive difference. Next, be an ally. It's a cliche in this world, but racism, sexism, etc. It needs to be fought on every front, and be an ally and challenge biases. Don't be afraid to call things out when you're in the workplace, regardless of the situation. It's a little bit more difficult when you're early in your career, and I'll be the first person to put my hand up and say that I tried to assimilate as much as possible when I first started out in the insurance industry. But the industry is changing, and you kind of got to be the change that you want to see. So please be an ally and challenge these biases. Finally, seek support. There's festivals like Dive In, there's opportunities for networking, there are employee resource groups in your own company, or industry groups. I've got to take this opportunity to plug ICANN, which I'm a part of. They do fantastic work, and in particular their mentorship platform, which is fantastic. And it's firsthand I've experienced how it can connect you with other very like-minded people with shared experiences in the industry. So yeah, just remember, understanding intersectionality is very much an ongoing process. Be patient, and it does involve a little bit of soul searching and self-exploration, but it is worth it, and it really benefits everyone.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I love that. How do we view the world? It's different from all of us, right? What works for one will be completely different for the others. And thanks again for the book recommendation, Andrew. That was really helpful. And the tips of how to approach the subject. There was a lot of learning there for us all. And love that. Seek support. Absolutely. If anybody needs any help, seek support. And I always love a plug. So well done you on that one. That takes me on to thinking about policies and attracting talent. Because that's what we do, right? In business. Jen, why is it important for professional industries to acknowledge and address intersectionality in their work?
So I'm going to try and build on some of the practical examples that Andrew just gave, and look at it with, more of a kind of company lens, and take a couple of examples of how the intersections can affect women in various demographics in the workplace. So, for example, white women earn 31% more than their Latina counterparts and 21% more than Black women in the US, according to a study. So if we think about just, that study and an organisation thinking about intersectionality in that lens, and you think about pay equity, we traditionally think about gender and women and men and pay differences. But the study that I just said to you really, I think, challenges us to think about to think more broadly with an intersectional lens and look at that data, make sure as a company we've got that data so that actually we can look more broadly than just gender. Another example is a study by the UN that found women with a disability globally have an employment rate of 20% compared to 53% for disabled men. So again, this type of data is really helpful as we think about our hiring policies, where and how we attract talent, both in our industry and our organisations. McKinsey have got some research that's shown that LGBT women, as well as women with disabilities, are much more likely to experience microaggressions on the job. So for me, it's like, thinking with this intersectional lens then leads us on to thinking about, well, how do we use the data that we've got as organisations, and how does that feed into the kind of programming that we might do in inclusion and diversity, DEI, etc. And really acknowledging those intersectional identities can help us think about our policies, our programmes, but also our culture and strengthen that culture. So if we think about the impact on our ERGs, or here at WTW, we call them inclusion networks, and the programming that they all do. And increasingly over the last few years, we've really seen, all these groups start to work much more closely together. And, that's obviously something that organisations, that's why it's important to think around intersectionality. I'm going to give a little plug too. There's a 2-minute YouTube video by someone called Kerry Gray about intersectionality. I really encourage everyone to watch it. She's really talking about how you can't split the different aspects of your identity. And I think that's really helpful as we think about programming, our inclusion networks, our ERGs, the really great work they're doing to help us kind of strengthen our culture, but not just in a binary way.
Okay, I was so busy writing notes there, Jen. That's fantastic. Thank you. I love the plug yet again. So Kerry Gray, and I think that's really important to look at the fact that it's really difficult to split intersectionality. And that's why we hear more and more of it now, because it is constantly a cross-section. And having the metrics in place is so important, because that allows us to have the pay equity. And that is also something very topical that we have started to make strides in, but we've still got some way to go. So thank you for highlighting that as well. Okay, moving on to Arani. Could you share some real life examples of how intersectionality might affect clients or claims in the insurance industry?
There we go. Not going to make the same mistake twice. Yes. So thanks, Kirat. I think in terms of clients and claims, I think the thing that we all need to remember is that there's statutory legislation in place, which is the Equality Act 2010. And 2010 was some time ago. And that statutory provision was basically a bringing together of lots of disparate legislation around basically protected characteristics. So, for example, gender, race, religion, lots of things, and things that have actually kind of been brought into the framework since then as well. I think there's something about, being having sort of preferences in terms of what you eat, or being discriminated about that as well. So there's definitely case law about that. I think the main thing for clients, though, is to understand that when you are dealing with policyholders, for example, that, it's not that you don't ever consider what somebody's apparent differences might be, because there are situations where that is totally legitimate. And I think that, it's incredibly key to believe that it's as much about bringing people together as it is about trying to understand people better. And it's not about becoming homogenous and, you know, we're all one group and we're all exactly the same because we're all a bit different and that makes us the same. That's not really how it works. So, for example, you know, in terms of refusal of cover, you know, you could do that or offer cover on different terms, sometimes because of disability, sex, gender reassignment, pregnancy, maternity. But it must show, as the insurance provider, that there's a difference in risk associated with one of these protected characteristics. So I think about documenting, you know, in some way what the thought process is. And that's something that I know happens anyway in terms of, you know, the underwriting and decisions that are made. But just to, I think, ensure that that is spelt out and that, you know, that there is some sort of policy that really demonstrates that that thinking has been done. And I think also just the differences between indirect and direct discrimination. So just to recap, direct discrimination is your more overt mistreatment due to a protected characteristic. So, for example, gender. And indirect discrimination occurs when someone is disadvantaged by rule or requirement. So it initially appears to be neutral and non-discriminatory, and when you look behind it, actually that's not how it appears. There's actually, you know, it appears to be all equal, but, you know, when you look under the surface, it really isn't. So I think in terms of services, purchasing options made online, that's an example where, say, if somebody was partially sighted, and one of my very close friends is partially sighted, you have to bear in mind that accessibility is something that is still not good. I mean, you know, if you even walk across London and you take the tube, and, you know, if it's not step-free access, you know, particularly also in terms of how things are printed or things are displayed on screen. A little nutshell fact that I quite like is that, you know, Times New Roman, I mean, it isn't the standard font now, but for a long time it was the standard font, and it was certainly a business font. I personally never really got on with that font. I didn't really like it. And it turns out that there's probably a reason why I don't like it, which is that it has serifs, which means that it has, you know, the sort of extra detail, like a top and a tail for every letter, rather than just being clear. And for people who are ADHD, dyslexic, for example, it can be quite hard to actually read properly fonts that are with serif. So a non-serif font like Arial, or Kennedy's favourite fonts as well. We have a preferred font that we use, but again, that's all a lot easier to read. So these are the things where actually it's not about making things better for one group of people. It's, I think, about understanding that there's more than one way of doing things, and to build that into not only our workplaces, but also our documentation, and also how we note our decisions as well. So that's really, I think, what I would say about that, because, you know, I do not hold myself out as an insurer. I work as a knowledge lawyer at Kennedy's, and I am very sure that all the insurers here and underwriters and brokers will be more than able to document and keep things in an orderly fashion. But I just think that sometimes those frameworks, we need to be really clear about what the exceptions are, where they are permitted and where they're not permitted. And I think also calling that out, because, you know, we can't, I think in terms of risk assessment, what we don't want to have is reputational damage for our companies. And the best way to do that is to know exactly what we should and shouldn't be doing, and to be completely on point with that. But also, if we see any movement away from that, to feel it's a safe environment to call it out. And if it's not a safe environment, then to think about whistleblowing. And, you know, I say that only because I think the integrity personally that we all must really hold is what makes all our respective industries and sectors, you know, have integrity. So it definitely rains down from leadership, but we all have a part to play in it.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Arani. And thanks for mentioning the Equality Act 2010 and the protected characteristics. As we know, accessibility opens opportunities. And personally, you're talking about the font and Arial, my favourite's Georgia, number 16. And you're absolutely spot on when you talk about claims and clients. And it's important to look at them individually. And sometimes insurance decisions have to be made to reflect that. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. And now over to Andrew. How can organisations use the framework around intersectionality to actually make progress? We know progress is being made, but we really want to make more. How do we do that?
Yeah, you're right. And, you know, progress doesn't always seem easy. I think a lot of people who are or have spent time in the I&D world can relate to that. Look, I think a lot of answers to this question are the same, whether we're talking about intersectionality or not. You know, we're talking about inclusive hiring practices, but where intersectionality comes in is our understanding of whether we've got a lack of representation in certain subsectors within certain groups, and our understanding of the nuances that are involved there. And even in inclusive hiring practice, our understanding of what kind of people we want in our talent acquisition teams to be making decisions about hiring, all the way up. Do we have understanding about different nuances in different groups, or at least do we have an open-minded approach at every level? So inclusive hiring, yes, but actually how do we, you know, the framework around intersectionality is just going that level deeper. The same goes for, in Gallagher, we call them workstreams, but, you know, there's an industry chat, so let's just call them employee resource groups. You know, you can support employee resource groups. And, you know, for me, it's that combination of employee resource groups combined with humble leadership, and using these employee resource groups as a source of knowledge and deep knowledge that is acquired through lived experiences. We've talked about that a lot on this chat. And these are things that not every leader is expected to know about, but there is the knowledge in your firms. So we can lean into our work streams, networks, employee resource groups to have this fount of knowledge and use that to progress our companies, offer these different perspectives and challenge currently entrenched ideas. Another one is inclusive training. If we understand, you know, data is a big part in this, if we understand the makeup of our companies and the intersectionalities and potentially where our shortcomings are, we can have pretty targeted training to address certain specific issues. And it's, you know, this is the theme really. We're just trying to go a level deeper in everything we're doing. You know, needless to say, we need to prioritize our general I&D goals, and we can embed, you know, pretty specific strategic goals into, you know, into our company performance to address very specific needs. Something I'm very passionate about, and something Gallagher and our networks have been very good at, is building long-term relationships with community groups and charity partners, and actually understanding what the communities in which we reside are trying to do and what they want from the companies that live around them. Obviously, you know, data has been talked about a lot here, and I'm just going to bang that drum a little more because it is essential. You know, we need to track our metrics. You know, we need to hold ourselves accountable, and you know, it's pretty obvious. However, an appreciation for intersectionality, you know, is pretty important in that regard. If we know that brown women, for example, are struggling in terms of wage stagnation after they come back from maternity leave, we can put in very specific policies to address that. And without good quality data and without understanding the specific issues that relate to certain specific demographics, it's very difficult to address these issues and create an equitable solution. And your pay gap reporting is always just going to look bad as a result. So I think the summary that I want to give is that intersectionality isn't about grouping everyone together. It's actually about looking a level deeper into the specific nuances with each group. And, you know, it's the first thing you learn at school is, you know, don't judge a book by its cover. You need to look a level deeper.
Great, thanks, Andrew. That was a great explanation for us all, and I think you summed it up perfectly when you talked about inclusive hiring practices. I mean, that's really key, and by looking at that, that's how we make changes. And we've talked about that throughout our session today. Metrics are key. Employee resource groups. I'm going to plug ICANN, who are brilliant at employee resource groups, and you should all follow them too. And that's how we're going to make key changes and huge waves. Training is an absolute must. We know that in all areas of life. That big goal, that builds goals and that builds relationships and that progresses us further. Okay, my final question is to all of you. I should choose who will go first. Let me start with the question. What is one practical action you would encourage our audience to take away from this session? Just one practical action, and I'll start with Jen, please.
So I would say widen your lens. Remember the image of the cows in the field and zoom out.
And then we're over to Arani.
Thanks, Kirat. For me, what I'd like everyone to take away from today is the ability to just turn your thinking by half a degree and to turn your thinking into what it means to be professional, and in your own experience, what does that look like, and to be real about that for yourself, and to think then, okay, if that's how it is for me and what I have to juggle and be to show up in the best way I can to do a good job every day, what might that look like for others around me? And if you're even just having a little think about it after today, for me, that's enough. Because I think it's just changing, thinking a different lens. I'm not here, I don't think any of us here to sort of change a mind or to get everyone to think a certain way. It's really just to offer an invite to think a little bit differently to perhaps how you did before this session.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, Andrew.
I think closely linked to the other two answers is, you know, going on that journey of self-understanding and exploration, understanding the perspective on which you look at the world, and therefore understanding your privileges, your biases, and then going back into the world, whether it's the workplace or your personal life, and understanding how you intersect with other people via that.
Okay, thank you. So before I start going through the questions, hopefully the audience have sent me, just to recap on that session: widen the lens and zoom out. Turn your thinking. What does that look like to you? Self-understanding and exploration. I love those. Thank you so much. Okay, so do we have some questions from the audience? Right, so the audience, can you please send some questions in for us? On this QR code. I jumped the gun there a bit. Apologies. Please send your questions to the QR code.
And just to say, no question is too great or too small or too out there. So any question is completely welcome.
Absolutely, thank you. I've got to put my glasses on for this one. How much progress is the insurance industry making in terms of DE&I? Is it positive? And what else must be done? Who wants to answer that one? Jen?
I'm quite happy to go first on that. So I was at the opening event this morning for Dive In, and as I was sitting there sort of listening, I thought back to kind of 9 years ago, which is obviously, I know Dive In's been going for 10 years. I've only been in this job for 9, and I think about how if we use Dive In as a gauge of the progress that we've made as an industry, some of the facts and figures about just how much the festival has grown in the 10 years, I think is a huge reflection on the progress that we've made. Think about all the companies now who are more transparent with their data. I think about how in insurance we're working together to drive this forward. Have we got more work to do? Yes, of course we have, but progress isn't just about one group. Think about the conversation we've been having today around intersectionality. I know many companies who would have started this work 10 years ago, probably thinking primarily thinking about gender equity. What's on the topic for this year's agenda is so huge. We're talking about ageism in the workplace. We're talking about neurodiversity, lots of subjects that we just weren't high on our agenda 10 years ago. So I think we've definitely made progress, and we should celebrate those successes. Have we got more work to do? Yes. So keep going.
Okay, thanks for that, Jen. And yeah, thanks for mentioning as well, happy 10th anniversary to Dive In. It's been life-changing for so many of us. Andrew or Arani, have you got any further comments to make on that question?
Yeah, I'll just reiterate. Sorry, Arani. It's just, it's so easy to get dour or cynical sometimes, but you're absolutely right. If I started in the industry in 2015, and the level of base understanding, I'm still in the same division as I was then in aerospace. It was JLT, it's now Gallagher, and the level of base understanding has improved markedly. It's something like, race and ethnicity is quite easy to see visibly in the workplace, and that has visibly improved in my time in the industry as well. It was an industry where at the time of joining, I, particularly in a specialty market, very much felt like the odd one out, and that is less the case now. Still a long way to go, but certainly marked improvement.
Okay, thank you.
I just would like to add that I think that there is a long way to go. I think that it's probably a little bit controversial, but a lot of the topics are recurring topics over the last 10 years. I think the new topics, or they're not new, but they're newly focused upon menopause, also caring responsibilities, a deeper understanding of social mobility and what that means. And I think the thing that's sometimes missed is that, having more than one thing that, marks you out, let's say, from a perceived norm, adds together. It's not sort of, it's this thing over here, so I'm a woman, a cis woman, identify as, I am a neurodiverse person, and I'm Asian, I'm South Asian. So are these things relevant to my day-to-day working? Not necessarily, but some of them might be if I am treated differently, or if as a result of being treated differently in one place and on the basis of one area, that might impact me elsewhere. And the whole thing is that it's not really about why we should have DE&I. The fact is that we're all have every right to be in the workplace. It's just to ensure that everyone is treated fairly. And we might not always realise, and I will say that for myself, that, you know, where we're not treating people the same or fairly. We all have our own spheres of experience and our own inherent biases, which are through our upbringing, through the influences that we have, the people around us, and also our workplaces. You know, our workplaces, these are places where, frankly, you know, you're probably going to meet people that you wouldn't meet otherwise, you know, and so the workplace is a really, really important place to ensure that we are coming together in a better way. And the other thing I would just like to say as well is that as far as our workplaces are concerned, it's absolutely vital, you know, in the industries that we work in. So, you know, insurance, law, you know, all the surrounding services, you know, our brokers, the insurance market. It's really, really important because we do have, I really believe, a moral obligation. You know, we are dealing in one way or another with the general public, and we have a duty to treat everyone fairly and to ensure that everyone has the same rights in terms of insurance, coverage, security, personal security. And that's whether you're talking about coverage claims or whether you're talking about working in one of our workplaces. So I'd really encourage everyone to keep all of this in mind, but to summarise what to keep in mind, just that being professional, I'll say it again, is I really think about including all of these things in our thinking, both, you know, internally with our teams, but also in terms of, you know, our external stakeholders as well.
Thank you. And, you know, again, all three of you made some really, really valid points there. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. I'm getting quite a few questions coming through now. There's one that I'd like to ask all of you, which I think would be really helpful for the audience and anybody watching this afterwards as well on Catch Up, is are there any other good books you could recommend to get a better understanding of this topic?
I've got one other book that springs to mind, which is probably the first time I read the word intersectionality. It is Why I Don't Talk to White People About Race by Arani Lodge. That is a seriously good book. It is very raw style of writing, and it is, you know, it does what it sets out to do in terms of challenging the norm and being from an anti-establishment kind of perspective. It's fantastic, so I can definitely recommend that.
Thanks, Andrew.
I would just add to that recommendation. I think that, I'll be honest, I think that book is making a lot of great points. It is something, it's quite no nonsense in the sense of, you know, it sort of expects you, Renee sort of expects you to come, you know, sort of ready. What I would say is that that book came about because of an article that Renee wrote in The Guardian. And if you Google Renee Lodge and The Guardian, you will find the article. And the article is really a very, I think, a really potent account of a lived experience. And I think then from that, you know, she got commissioned to write a book, and, you know, there's further chapters that go into it. But in terms of an introduction, and this is not to say that, you know, people can't read the book or it's too much, but I think just as an introduction, particularly if you haven't had to, I think we will have had to, but if you feel like you'd like to know more, or the word itself, I think, is pretty unhelpful. So I think reading an account of somebody's lived experience is always really powerful. So I would just off the back of what Andrew's saying, I would say go light initially, and have a Google of that Guardian article, and we can, I'm sure, share some resources and links afterwards.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Arani. And Jen, have you got any recommendations?
Put me on the spot after going after those two. I think those are great recommendations. I would also say actually is there's some brilliant podcasts out there around intersectionality. So it doesn't always have to be books and articles. You know, if your learning style is different, play to that, and Google is our friend.
Yeah, great, thank you. And you're right, there are some great podcasts out there as well. So that's always an easier way at times when you just want to listen to something when you're on a commute or at the gym or running a marathon or whatever you're doing. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, so I've got one here that says, how can we encourage people to provide optional data points which make them feel uncomfortable that they might be judged? For example, school meals. And I think that's going back to a lot of the metrics now that we've talked about as well, when people are joining companies or whether they've been there a long time. We are being asked to fill in certain data, which is making some people, and I presume this is regarding socioeconomic status, feel uncomfortable. What are your thoughts on that? Can I start, Arani? You're nodding your head quite a bit here, so I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, I've got quite a lot to say about this, but I'll keep it short, everybody, don't worry. I think a lot of these questions are not, as I said earlier, I don't think they're fit for purpose for today. I think what it doesn't, I mean, I'm saying this and I frankly, can't demonstrate any sort of knowledge of, in terms of ONS, for example, or census results, or, how companies look at this information, because I do think that things aren't seen together. So, for example, I'll give you an example for me. I mean, I am the child of immigrants, and my family came over, my parents came over from Sri Lanka to England in the 1970s. And they had both been to university, and that's not because they were really wealthy or because, they had very secure upbringings. Frankly, my dad certainly didn't. But that was just the cultural, I suppose, ticket out. And I think that for them, education was the highest form of currency, really. So you were rich if you were educated. So that's just in their community. So, I probably buck a bit of a trend. I mean, and that's not to say that sort of all people who are brown and, neurodivergent and cis female, but, I don't fit into the box, as it were, of, child of immigrants, probably, their parents didn't go to university and you're the first person to go to university. I'm not, So I think that, yeah, I'm not sure about some of these questions, but what I would say is that currently that's the best that we've got in terms of data. And I think what's important is, I'm not saying everyone has to do this, but I personally never not answer the questions. There's always a prefer, well, there should be always a prefer not to say. So if you prefer not to say, that's still data, rather than, not filling it in at all. And I think the more that, I'm not here to champion the prefer not to say, but, that data point in and of itself could lead to change, because, it would be, well, actually, it's not really capturing what we wanted to capture. The other thing I would just say to round off on this is that in terms of data points and processes, I think that the part of the problem is that data points need to be incorporated into a process. So it shouldn't be that you have to go out of something or kind of, fill in another form over here, or, go to this web page over here, or this part of the intranet, or whatever. It should be that it's somehow captured through, actually doing the thing you need to do, and in a way that isn't underhand or, sort of undercover in any way, but it's just part of what you do every day. And I think, that's a much bigger conversation about how you might go about that. But I think that's the thing. I think, it's not just about D&I. It's, understanding that data now is really the gold of, I think, most sectors. And it's something that we're all sort of, I think, grappling with in terms of how to make sure that our data is where it needs to be and that it can be helpful in, influencing and driving forward in the future.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And it is, I mean, there's been a huge shift on data metrics and entry, and it is, I mean, it kind of springboard onto pay equity as well. So, as you said, there's different schools of thoughts on how, and a lot of topics around this on how we work on this going forward. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to ask Jen next what your thoughts are.
So just to build on that, I would say that as organisations, we need to share with people why we want the data and how we're going to use that. And I think that helps build levels of trust around, people giving us that data. Because increasingly, everything you do, you're being asked for data and more personal and sensitive data. As organisations, we've got a duty to be really, really clear with people about how we're going to use that data, how we're going to safeguard it, who's got access to that data. But I think the more data we get, the more we can play that back to people and use the examples. I think in the early days, you're sort of stuck in this place where you haven't got enough data to be able to sort of be transparent and play it back to people as to how you're using it.
Thanks, Jen. And that's a huge, really important point about trust safeguarding. Who is going to use that data? You can trust us if you are going to fill in the forms. So thank you for mentioning that. And lastly, over to Andrew. What are your thoughts?
I'm afraid I've got nothing new to add. I just completely reiterate that the burden is on the company to create a culture in which trust is earned from their employees. And the burden is not on the individual to feel like they should do it. The burden is on the company to create a culture where people feel safe to disclose their data.
Thanks, Andrew. I think that was a brilliant way of ending what both Jen and Arani said as well. So thank you. And that brings me to say a huge thanks to our panel, our audience. Thanks for joining us, and everyone involved behind the scenes in making our event, What is Intersectionality and Why Does It Matter?, such a huge success by supporting inclusion and by being the change we want to see in the world. Thank you for joining us.